Good evening and welcome to the news today. The United States and Turkey have tentatively agreed to cooperate in forming an Islamic State-free zone in northern Syria. This as Turkey passes on with the shelling of not only IS targets, but also strikes on Kurdish militants. That is becoming increasingly controversial, with NATO warning the bombing campaign will endanger any progress already made towards peace between Turkey and the PKK. Correspondent Ayman Siksik has the story.
A crackdown on IS militants, continued airstrikes in neighboring Iraq, and an army now involved outside Turkish borders. Turkey's getting tough. At least 15 people suspected of links to the Islamic State group have been detained after Turkish police raided homes in Ankara in a major security sweep. In the southeastern city of Adıyaman, 19 people with alleged links to the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, were also detained. The arrests came after mass protests erupted in the southeast of the country against the strikes on PKK targets. One demonstrator was killed in the standoff with the Turkish army, fueling claims that Turkey is trying to quash pro-PKK protests. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan discussed the escalation with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin on Monday. Meanwhile, Turkish military involvement in neighboring countries continues to deepen. Iraq. Turkish fighter jets returned Monday after bombing targets in the mainly Kurdish region of Hakurk in northern Iraq. Sunday night strikes could signal the end of the ceasefire between Turkey and the PKK, signed only in 2013 after nearly 3 decades of armed struggle. Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu said the Kurdish insurgency against Ankara is a security threat, and the strikes will continue until his country is satisfied that its borders are safe. But a dramatic announcement made Monday could see Turkey expanding its activities even closer to its borders. Syria. Ankara firmly denied today that it had struck Kurdish YPG positions in the north of Syria. The YPG, a self-proclaimed Democratic People's Army, said Turkish tanks hit its positions in the village of Zurmagar in Aleppo, wounding 4 members of the allied rebel force and several villagers. Despite Turkey's denial, the country's border with Syria is heating up, also due to a different threat: the Islamic State.
We have relatives in Syria. We've received a phone call from them. They said the Islamic State had been threatening to launch an assault on them. They got into cars and had to leave. Many of them have left and went to nearby towns.
Turkey has dramatically escalated its role in the US-led coalition against the Islamic State group, in a move which could shift its position and influence in the Middle East.
And with me right now is retired Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining me.
It's a great privilege.
Good to see you again, Richard. So, Richard, let's try to explain to me the balance of power right now, because the United States and Turkey, both of them are basically targeting 2 different things. Because if we're seeing and looking at Turkey doesn't want the Syrian regime to continue being where it is. And the United States actually just a few months ago, or just a few weeks ago, just said that it refers that Bashar al-Assad will stay in his position. Now they're combining forces against IS. How does it going to work? Because I don't understand.
I don't think I understand, and it's also complicated by the fact that the United States have been using fighters in Syria and Iraq who are associated with the Kurdish group PKK, which is also fighting Turkey. It's a designated terrorist group fighting Turkey. The US have been using fighters associated with them to attack the Islamic State. And Turkey is not only beginning an offensive against the Islamic State, it's also renewing its offensive against the PKK. In other words, Americans' other allies, or elements of the Americans' other allies.
Colonel,
the attacks are taking place.
Colonel Kemp, we will call you again because we are having some difficulties with the line. So we will call you again and we'll put you on the phone. Thank you for now. And I'm right now here with Barak, Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Service Institute that deals with national and international defense and security. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. We are trying to understand right now the very complicated situation because the balance of power is changing. And yesterday I tried to verify this complex situation between the PKK and the government, the Turkish government, and understanding if it's coming from an ego or it's the long-term battle that we already know about, or is it even IS that should be one common enemy, is actually not managing to be this common enemy, and they are still fighting each other. So what is happening?
Everything's clearly in flux, and it's very difficult for any party, whether it be the United States, the Kurds, the Turks, to actually map out a coherent strategy because there's so many conundrums. So on one hand, you've got Turkey that is being accused by the PKK of having facilitated ISIS efforts against them, and at the same time, Turkey has had a tacit role in approving ISIS behavior, whether it be smuggling, etc. And yet Turkey is threatened by ISIS. You've got America that has been offering logistical and air power support to the PKK, whether it be air support against the town of Kobani to fight back ISIS, and they've been incredibly successful. Yet at the same time, America has been providing Turkey since 2007 with a tremendous amount of intelligence of the PKK's operations and bases in Iraq, which Turkey subsequently bombed. So Turkey as well, it went from a no enemies policy to a no friends policy. So
but do you think that
everything is in flux?
Everything is in flux, and I'm trying to understand how you can combine, because like I tried to ask Colonel Kemp, there is a common enemy here. There is somebody who, all the forces should combine their strength together and try to fight it. But it seems that IS, instead of making like a common wall that will fight it, it's like making all the sides fight each other. So how they are not finding this common ground to actually...
I think one of the reasons why it's very difficult to find a common ground is we're not fighting a war in the West where there are nation states. We're fighting it in the Middle East, which America, even until now, fails to understand, is made up of multiple ethnicities and clans, not by the Westphalian state unit, which it's accustomed to in the West. And as a result of that, it finds itself confronted by a number of conundrums. When you said beforehand, is it going to be ego or is it going to be genuine national security? I think that, for example, somebody like Erdogan, his policy will be, right, let's try and align or rationalize post facto.
Yes.
Bolstering national security, increasing repression, ending the peace agreement with the PKK and the ceasefire that has taken place for 2 years, and let's crush all our enemies. We're not going to be able to crush the Assad regime, which is what Turkey originally wanted. So they're going to have both a minimalist and a maximalist scope. They will be able to target the PKK and ISIS simultaneously, and until now, America never allowed Turkey to strike the PKK.
We have, again, on the phone right now, retired Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Good evening. Thank you very much again for joining me.
Good evening, a pleasure.
So, Colonel Kemp, try to explain to me right now the current situation, because you started explaining this specific situation, and I'm trying to understand what this, let's say, new combination between Turkey and the United States is going to lead in Syria.
Well, I think what we're going to see ultimately in Syria is we're going to see President Assad, or at least some kind of successor to President Assad, running a big chunk of the country. I don't think we're going to see that the regime falling. I think we're going to see them still in charge of part of the country, but we're going to see other parts split off, and we're going to see, I think, with Turkey coming in. I mean, Turkey has got an extremely effective army, one of the most effective armies in the world, and a very big army, which also, of course, being part of NATO, it is able to function and operate very closely with US and other NATO forces. I think we're going to...
Colonel Kemp, when we're talking about a buffer zone, when we're talking about this specific situation and the United States and Turkey combining forces together, is it going to deteriorate? Because it sounds more right now like an opening of a war. Or maybe it always was a war and we weren't aware of it.
What do you mean a war? Do you mean a war against the Islamic State?
A war against the Islamic State, or maybe, opening another front in front of Syria, but, maybe taking, and I'm trying just to think here, maybe Turkey is actually using the United States to actually topple Bashar al-Assad from his regime in this way.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if Bashar al-Assad does not get toppled. I think that's probably quite likely to happen. But I don't think that, and I think the U.S. is obviously committed to containing the Islamic State, but it's also, I believe, committed to retaining the Assad regime anyway, not necessarily he himself in power. So I think that, both have to an extent a similar objective. Of course, the Americans now with their newfound friendship with Iran, one of their main interests and one of the things been driving U.S. policy is the need not to annoy Iran, and particularly now with President Obama still in power and the deal fresh, and President Obama having invested so much political capital in that deal with Iran, I think the Iranians can pretty much call the shots here, and it's the Iranians, I think, that can dictate to some extent with the Americans how far they can and can't go in defeating the Islamic State and strengthening President Assad.
Yes, Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you very, very much for this. Barak, Colonel Kemp just mentioned Iran and the involvement of Iran in this, because Iran is involved whether we like it or not. After the signing of the agreement, is this situation can deteriorate to more complicated because Turkey and, let's say, the United States are in favor of the Iran deal?
Look, so on one hand, you're going to see that this is going to go against the interests of the Sunnis, whether it be the nation-state actors, responsible nation-state actors such as Gulf states, or the irresponsible terrorist sub-state actors like ISIS. So this is going to empower the Shia and their proxy, which is the Assad regime, and at the same time Turkey is going to have to make increasing overtures towards Iran, and that's the new panoply that you're seeing in the Middle East.
It's amazing. We just, before we started this edition, you were talking and we said it's really complicated and really hard to understand what is happening right now, but very interesting. Barak Sinor, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.